All right, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started here today. Welcome to the IBS Speaker Series. We're having Hilary give a really interesting talk today. But before we start, I have just a few announcements. As we work towards better inclusive practices here at IBS, I did want to note that we are recording today's meeting, and we, of course, appreciate being able to see each other. So if you would like to have your camera on, you can have it on. However, we also acknowledge that the Zoom fatigue is real, so you can also feel free to turn off your camera if you are experiencing that, or if there are other reasons why you don't want to have your camera on. We will be using the chat and the raise hand features for clarifying questions during the presentation. Please hold any other questions towards the end or to the end. Some of you may be able to see that we have subtitles enabled. That's new, so we're just figuring this out. So if you have questions about that, you can feel free to privately message me. There's also ways to see the live transcript where it'll note who is speaking and what they are saying. That is available. If you see down at the bottom, there is a CC box that says live transcript. If you click the up arrow, you can view the full transcript. You can also turn off the subtitles. Since the subtitles do show up automatically, I have them turned off because I can see how it would be very distracting, but it is nice to have that full transcript availability. As I said, if you have any questions, feel free to email me or send me a chat message. Let's see, we are also able to, if you would like to rename yourself to have your pronouns on the Zoom name that shows up, we can feel free to do that and message me if you have any questions as to how to do that. And finally, we like to include a land acknowledgement statement. So the Institute of Behavioral Science at CU Boulder acknowledges that the university sits upon land within the territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. Further, we acknowledge that the 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. And with that, I'm going to pass this off to Hannah, and she can introduce our speaker today.
Good afternoon. I'm Hannah Brenkert-Smith. I am an associate research professor with the Environment and Society program here at IBS. I am so pleased to introduce Dr. Hilary Byerly. Hilary is a postdoc on an NSF project entitled Behavioral Nudges in a Wildfire Context, Social Comparisons, and Community Type. She is funded through this NSF award, along with additional funding from the U.S. Forest Service through the Human Dimensions program at the Rocky Mountain Research Station in Fort Collins. Hilary completed her PhD in natural resources at the University of Vermont, where she was a fellow at the Gund Institute. She holds a master's in applied economics from Cornell, and she is a CU undergrad alum. Hilary has been working with us since the summer of 2019. And today, Hilary will be presenting results from a part of the project work that she led with our practitioner partners from Ashland Fire and Rescue, which is the primary organization that engages homeowners in wildfire risk education and mitigation in Ashland, Oregon. And Ashland, Oregon is a city of just over 20,000 residents that recently rezoned its entire city as wildland-urban interface because it faces such high wildfire risk. So, thank you all for being here today, and I want to extend a special welcome to any wildfire practitioners who have joined us today. When we engage with practitioners, our research can be more timely and relevant and useful, and so we are so grateful when they're at the table, even if that table has to be virtual. So with that, I will turn the reins over to Hilary.
Great, thank you, Hannah. Can you see my screen? Slides? Not quite. Okay. How about now? Yes, great. Okay. Thank you, Hannah, and thank you all for joining me today. I am excited to share some work on wildfire risk and household behavior that I've been working on for a while. But I want to start first by acknowledging all of the tremendous people that have helped make this work possible, including Hannah and some other folks at federal agencies, Katie Gibble and Chris Chambers at Ashland Fire and Rescue, as Hannah mentioned, Colleen, Allie, and Carolyn at the Wyrie Center, a few photographers who generously lent their photography to be used in this research, and of course the funders. So I'm gonna start off with a statement that is likely salient to you, those of you in Colorado and elsewhere around the West, and that's that wildfire presents a growing challenge. It's not the fire itself that is problematic. Fire is actually a natural and healthy part of many ecosystems. But with climate change, we're seeing more frequent and intense wildfires. And this is compounded by growing development in the wildland-urban interface, or WUI. And this is the area where houses are in or near wildland vegetation. You can see in this aerial photo or image from a community near where I live in Jackson, Wyoming. These houses are built up into the hillsides, abutting national forest. They're actually built within fire-adapted ecosystems and against some dense fuel loads on forested lands. And this development is happening across the West. So in this map here, the areas in gray and red show the mapped WUI in 2010. And then the areas in red specifically are areas that have burned between the year 2000 and 2016. So these wildfires are not just happening in remote forested areas. They're happening where people are, where homes are. And so the heart of the challenge is really that homes are igniting in wildfire. And so because a home's ability to ignite is determined by its characteristics in relation to its immediate surroundings, and these homes are privately owned, homeowner behavior really matters in addressing this challenge. Increasing focus is put on the home ignition zone, which is the materials, design, and maintenance of a structure in relation to its surroundings within 30 meters. And some researchers have found that mitigation of the home ignition zone is really the most cost-effective investment, so more than suppression or fuel management, to reduce home destruction. And therefore, mitigation responsibility really must be centered on homeowners. And these large-scale WUI fire disasters cannot be prevented without homeowners actively creating and maintaining fire-safe structures and defensible space. And while we have better evidence on the importance of this home ignition zone, we now face a second-order challenge, which is that we lack causal evidence on how to get homeowners to do this mitigation work, or even how to get homeowners to engage in learning about their wildfire risk and responding to outreach. Work in wildfire social sciences has found correlational evidence that associates mitigation action with information from professionals, talking with neighbors, direct experience with wildfire, and risk perceptions. One recent study found that many homeowners report lack of property-specific information as a barrier to doing mitigation work. And as researchers sort of try to suss this out, of course, outreach proceeds on the ground. Numerous government agencies and organizations are investing resources in this sort of homeowner outreach. One example is the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network, which is a national network with dozens of communities and hundreds of practitioners as members, all sharing knowledge about how to connect with homeowners and build more resilient communities. Many of these communities are collecting parcel level wildfire risk data, trying to understand where the risks sit within these communities and perhaps guide some targeting. But overall, many practitioners lack evidence on how to effectively engage homeowners and often rely on personal experience, anecdotes, and sometimes preconceived notions about what works and what doesn't. And so, given the importance of influencing homeowner behavior to mitigate home destruction from wildfire, how should wildfire programs deliver outreach to homeowners? This is really the big question driving this research. which was developed in partnership with WIRE, Wildfire Research. It's a group of wildfire practitioners and researchers working in 16 counties across 6 states in the West. We partner with nearly a dozen wildfire mitigation organizations, most of whom are interested in building evidence towards this question. And then for this study, as Hannah mentioned, we worked with Ashland Fire and Rescue. They agreed to run a field experiment to test different strategies in their outreach. And so I'm going to frame up the study that we developed together by really transparently presenting the process. It was knowledge co-production, really driven by Ashland Fire and Rescue's goals and constraints and questions, and then iteratively moving between theory and evidence and conversations with practitioners. So Ashland, Oregon is this little red dot on the map. It's in southwestern Oregon, right on the border with California. It's a city that's not unlike Boulder, actually has great food, backs up to these forested hillsides. This is a aerial photo of Ashland. And as Hannah mentioned, in 2018, all of the properties within the city were designated as part of a wildfire hazard zone. Ashland's also adjacent to Talent, Oregon, where the Alameda fire burned more than 3,000 acres and destroyed 3,000 structures in September of last year. So wildfire is really a top priority for this community. And as part of their strategy, they collected parcel level risk data for all 6,600 properties within the city. So a staff member traveled the streets, assessed structures' characteristics, defensible space, background fuels, and emergency access, and then scored the property for its overall wildfire risk. And in that assessment, they found that 62% of properties within the community face high, very high, or extreme risk of wildfire. Ashland also worked with WIRE to put out a household survey, and in that survey, 82% of respondents said that specific information about what needs to be done on my property would encourage action to reduce wildfire risk. So with this context, and then we looked at the programmatic outreach that Ashland was interested in. Their goals were to inform residents of this parcel level risk data and to provide resources for residents to take action. The outreach that they were interested in doing was a postcard mailing to property owners. And then the desired short run outcome was to drive property owners to visit a web page that described that personal property level risk information. And as a researcher, this outcome was nice because it happens on a much shorter time scale than a lot of the mitigation work, and it's also easily measured. And so within these sort of the scaffolding and these constraints, we started to think about the behavioral bottlenecks. So why might homeowners not engage in their risk information when Ashland sends it out? And so potentially there are 2 subgroups that might not engage. One group that might just not be interested. So these folks may not think that wildfire is a problem. They may lack information. They may not think that it's their problem. So a lack of responsibility or even agency, an lack of clarity about what they can do about it. Some folks may just not want to know and would rather avoid that uncomfortable information. And then perhaps there's another group that's sort of further along the spectrum, and these folks may be interested and aware of the problem, but are not following through. And so these residents may not know what to do, so there may be a lack of a clear call to action. They may not have time, so consciously thinking, yeah, this matters, but it's just not a priority. Or they may not have time right now, so perhaps some unconscious procrastination, thinking this really is a priority. I want to do something about it, but I'll just get to it later. And so with these in mind, we started on some idea generation. So what might cause homeowners to engage? What sorts of strategies in Ashland's outreach might induce more engagement among homeowners? And so we looked at different literatures. Within behavioral economics, we considered how changes to mailings had affected household behavior in other contexts. We looked at risk communication and information seeking behavior and natural hazards. And we developed a number of ideas. One group focused on social norms, which is particularly interesting, I think, in the wildfire context because of the risk interdependence of wildfire risk. So the risk on my property directly affects that faced by my neighbors, my proximate neighbors, and vice versa. So perhaps sharing some information about the risk level of neighbors or the behaviors of neighbors might compel residents to take action. We talked about creating some deadlines to induce some kind of sense of urgency to overcome that procrastination, or maybe asking residents to engage rather than telling them, or even focusing on actionable information. So thinking about increasing perceived behavioral control, or a feeling that people could actually do something about their risk by highlighting the risk factors that were actionable, like defensible space. And so I flew out to Ashland a year ago and workshopped a bunch of these ideas with residents, got a range of feedback, but throughout this process, this more formal qualitative process, we kept coming back to this question with our partners, which was what image was going to be on the front of the postcard. And some had suggested maybe a photo of flames was best to really grab homeowners' attention. But then others pushed back and they said that perhaps was too risky, too provocative, and might backfire, and that homeowners might disengage with that kind of imagery. And so we spoke with a few other practitioners in our network and identified what appeared to be really a controversy within the field, an area where we could learn about homeowner behavior, inform real programmatic outreach, and then provide evidence towards this open debate, and in which experts in the field have questions and assumptions, but lack evidence-based guidance. And there's, of course, good reason to expect that the photo on the postcard would matter. A number of studies have found photos to have greater influence on behavior than statistics or information. In this study by Paul Slovic and colleagues, they looked at the effect of the widespread publication of a photo of a drowned Syrian boy on a Turkish beach in early September 2015. And what they observed was, even though over the past 4 years, hundreds of thousands of Syrians had died, millions had been displaced by the civil war, it was with the publication of that photograph that they saw a spike in interest in the issue. So these are Google searches for terms refugees and Syria, and then also a spike in donations to a Red Cross campaign designated for Syrian refugees. And so as we started to think about the treatment or the flames photo that we might use in our study, we were also interested in one that had appeared in the media describing wildfire. So one that represented the compelling and sometimes sensational way that wildfire is depicted, as well as other natural hazards. And then we wanted a photo that represented the controversy around using fire imagery in wildfire communications. And that was really kind of a gut check from our practitioner partners. And so the photo that we selected is here on the left. It's a photo that appeared in a National Geographic story about wildfires in California, of which you can see they've done many with a similar aesthetic. It's a photo that was used with permission from the photographer, Mark Thiessen. And when I reached out to him to ask for his permission, he himself expressed interest in knowing how his photography affects homeowner behavior. And so as we thought about next, what would be our comparison, we had to determine the number of versions we could use. We ran a power analysis based on expected effects from fear appeals and the moderator effect we wanted to test. We determined that we could send one other version of the postcard. And so for our comparison, our control was not going to be no postcard or not even no photo, because those wouldn't accurately reflect or realistically reflect Ashland's outreach, or that contrast of flames versus no flames when practitioners decide what imagery to use on their outreach. And instead we landed on this photo on the left. And we selected it because we felt it represents the status quo. It's a photo you can see is used on 2 websites in which Ashland talks about wildfire issues. It also appeared on a postcard to Ashland residents several years ago. And it's a photo that's regularly used by Ashland Fire and Rescue staff when presenting about programs and projects related to wildfire, because of the way it depicts the relationship between the city and then the forested watershed above town, almost sort of showing what's to be protected by mitigating extreme wildfire in the area. And in developing our hypotheses, how is the photos of flames to affect homeowner behavior compared to that status quo? We really considered that it could go either way. And I think this speaks to the open debate that motivated the treatment selection in the first place. On the one hand, it seemed very plausible that the flames photo could cause homeowners to tune in and to pay attention. To the extent that that photo elicits emotion, we know that emotion can act as a heuristic or a mental shortcut and capture attention and aid in information processing and even probability assessments. Fear and negative affects specifically have shown to influence behavior, including information seeking and policy support. And then showing those flames on sort of starting to take over a home could also increase the salience of consequences to homeowners. So making kind of what's at stake more real and more vivid, and help perhaps overcome some of that present bias and procrastination. And we also have evidence that people are loss averse. So a loss tends to hurt more or be felt more than a gain of equal amount. So that to the extent that we were highlighting the potential losses from wildfires rather than the gains from mitigation, people might be more sensitive to that. On the other hand, it seemed possible that the flames could cause homeowners to tune out. So certain negative emotions can create a sense of hopelessness. There's nothing to be done about this. People might engage in willful ignorance or avoidance to avoid this uncomfortable information, or even reactance. People might not want to be scared into submission. So to test these theories, or these hypotheses rather, we developed 3 studies. So one is the field experiment that I've mentioned, which sought to really contribute causal evidence on the effect of negative or flames imagery on homeowner behavior and risk communications. We also developed 2 surveys to help contextualize and understand the results from the experiment. And so I'm going to present the methods and results from those surveys first, and then get into the field experiment. So because this study was motivated by certain assumptions that we had heard from wildfire practitioners, we wanted to identify whether those assumptions held for a larger sample of experts, and also particularly for the photos that we had selected to use in our experiment. We were also curious to gauge practitioners' sense of controversy within their field about using flames imagery to communicate with homeowners. And so our sample was individuals who work professionally on issues related to wildfire. We used convenient sampling, so we recruited from within our network and then also posted on the message board of this Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. But the survey asked practitioners to take a moment and examine these 2 photos, the photos from the field experiment, and then ask them, which do you think is more effective in engaging homeowners to learn more about their wildfire risk? We also asked practitioners which photo was more preferred, which would they rather use in their communications, and then about their perceptions of agreement or disagreement within the field about using these types of flames photos to communicate with homeowners. And then for our manipulation check survey, we wanted to identify differences between the photos used in our experiment, those 2 in the top, as well as whether those differences were generalizable to similar photos. So the photo on the bottom left here appeared on a postcard mailing to residents in a Colorado community, directing them to visit a personalized website about wildfire risk, so a very similar context. And then the photo on the bottom right appeared in a few media outlets after a fire in Estes Park. And so for the survey, we worked with an online survey company called Prolific. And Prolific allowed us to select our sample based on self-reported homeownership and residence in one of the most 15 wildfire-prone states in the United States. Participants were told to imagine that they live in an area at risk from wildfire and that they had been mailed a postcard from the local fire department describing their property's wildfire risk. And then on the other side of that postcard was a photo. Participants were randomly assigned to view one of these 4 photos and then asked about their emotional response, a probability assessment, and also a couple potential confounders. So for the expert prediction survey, we received 120 responses. And regarding which photo was thought to be more effective, we found that most respondents, 83% of practitioners, expected that or thought that the flames photo was more effective than the community photo. Also, a majority, 62%, preferred to use the flames photo in their outreach to homeowners, although not all who thought the flames photo to be more effective would choose to use it in their communications. And then, as I said, we also asked practitioners if in their experience, there was agreement between their peers about whether photos of flames engage or repel homeowners when communicating about wildfire risk. And here about half said yes. Most practitioners think flames engage homeowners. Almost the other half said no, there's not agreement about the effect of flames photos. And then only 3% responded that most practitioners do not think photos matter in homeowner communications. And then for our manipulation check survey, we had a sample of about 440, so about 110 in each treatment. And here, what this table shows is the average response to these questions about emotion and risk and some personal preferences. And most responses were given on a 10-point Likert scale. And so what we can see from this table is that the flames photos, participants who viewed the flames photos rated themselves as feeling more worried, anxious, and fearful than those who had viewed the community photos. They also reported feeling less calm, less peaceful, and less safe. Those who viewed the flames photos also rated their imagined home as slightly more risky than those who viewed the community photos. And the flames photos were less well liked and less personally relevant within our sample than the community photos. And so then we moved to the field and tested how these photos affect homeowner behavior. As I said, Ashland Fire and Rescue had conducted these rapid wildfire risk assessments for all the properties within the city. So they had risk scores for every property, and that data was merged with a mailing list from the county assessor's office. That allowed us to identify owners of multiple properties. And then we assigned property owners to receive either the community photo postcard or the flames photo postcard. And we randomized assignment according to a property's wildfire risk. So there were the same number of households, of low risk households receiving the flames and community photo, and the same number of extreme risk households receiving each version of that of the postcard. Then we tracked website visitation. So here's a screenshot of the personalized risk website. And so this has a kind of site-specific address, describes the risk factors and the overall risk score. And then scrolling down, there's detailed information on each of those risk themes. So background risk, structural characteristics, access, and defensible space. And then here's a snapshot of the backside of the postcard. So this was the same for both versions of the postcard. Homeowners were informed about their overall property risk. They were directed to visit this website to learn more. They were provided with a personal access code, and this helped protect privacy, and it also enabled tracking. And then we included this statement, which explicitly said, this website provides specific information on how to reduce wildfire risk on your property. And this was to address that barrier to mitigation action that had been identified in the household survey of Ashland residents. And then we were also interested, so not just in whether there was an overall difference between the two photos in response, but whether the response changed by a parcel's wildfire risk. So this was motivated in part by recent research by my colleague, James Meldrum, and in partnership with West Region Wildfire Council, who sent out letters to residents in Western Colorado, and some of whom were also provided this property-specific risk information. So some households were told their property's risk level. And what we found in that study is that those informed that their property risk was high were more likely to go to the website. Sorry, this was a similar design. So homeowners received this letter and then were directed to visit a website to learn more, and that was the outcome. And so property owners who had learned that their property risk was high were more likely to go to the website than property owners who learned that their property risk was low. And then it also seemed plausible that the specific treatment in our study would work differently for folks facing different risks on their properties. So a homeowner who receives this sort of powerful flames imagery and then flips over the postcard to see that their property risk is low may respond differently than a homeowner who sees that imagery and flips the postcard over to see that their risk is very high. And so what did we find? Well, overall, about 20% of Ashland residents went to visit their personalized website, but we did not see any statistical difference between the response to the two photos. So those who received the community photo were as likely to visit the website as those who received the flames photo. But when we dig in a bit deeper and we look at how website visits vary by wildfire risk, and we modeled this effect, we found that for low risk properties, the flames photo increased web visits by about 3% compared to the community photo. But for every 100-point increase in a property's risk score, so as properties became riskier, the flames photo actually decreased the likelihood of visiting the website by about 2.5%. So taken together, got a handful of takeaways. So the expert prediction survey, we found really an expectation by the experts that the flames photo would be more effective at engaging homeowners. Also, despite what was mostly a consensus within our results, there was an indication that a number of practitioners perceived controversy about the use of flames in homeowner communications. For the manipulation check, we found that the flames photos elicited more negative emotions, so more worry, anxiety, and fear than the community photos. And that was true even though these photos had low personal relevance to the sample. We also found some evidence that the flames photos affected and increased risk perceptions. And then for our field experiment, we found no difference overall between response to these two photos, but upon a closer look that the flames photo increased response among low-risk households, but decreased response by high-risk households. So we've got a number of lessons learned and certainly a number of open questions from this, as any good research study does. I think the first and big one for me is that even though experts really largely expected the flames to be to affect homeowners and to drive homeowner behavior, and we observed that the flames photo elicited emotion and may have affected risk perceptions, we did not observe any overall power of imagery behavioral effect from the flames photo. We don't know exactly why. I have a few guesses, and I would certainly be interested to hear your thoughts. We're at the interpretation stage of this study where we're making sense of things. So in the Q&A, suggestions, ideas are certainly welcome. Another big sort of insight with this study is that there was a discrepancy between what experts expected and then what we actually observed when we went out to the field and tested it. As I said, practitioners overwhelmingly expected the flames photo to be more effective, but overall this was not the case. And in fact, among high-risk households where outreach is arguably more important, the flames photo actually reduced engagement. And so I think this really highlights the importance of testing assumptions and building evidence in this field and in others probably. And then there's an open question regarding the heterogeneity or the difference in response that we saw according to wildfire risk. I have a few hypotheses as to why we observed this heterogeneity. So one pathway may be a sort of automatic response. It's possible that the flames photo caught the attention of all homeowners, but among the high-risk homeowners, that combination of the flames photo and the "you are high risk" information created discomfort. And the response to that discomfort could have been avoidance, so deliberately not visiting the website to avoid difficult feelings or thoughts, willful ignorance, so avoiding becoming informed to avoid having to make undesirable decisions, or hopelessness. So it's actually a recent study by some folks at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and they found that the more infectious that people believe COVID-19 to be, the less willing they were to take social distancing measures. And authors call this a fatalism effect, but you could think about it just like, why even bother? Why even try? And so it's also possible that rather than that sort of emotional automatic response, that the combination of the flames photo and the high risk information activated a more analytical system 2 thinking. So there's some evidence that personal involvement or personal relevance can increase analytical processing. And so perhaps high risk properties, after learning they're high risk, feeling that that information is personally relevant, took a closer look at the flames photo and expressed some reactance. So a feeling of, I don't like this, don't fearmonger. To the extent that that first more automatic pathway is true, I think it raises a deeper question, and that's whether these responses are kind of embedded in the psyche of high-risk property owners. So insofar as property owners are in control of their property's risk, is their failure to address that risk connected to the same attitude or feeling or response that was elicited when making that risk salient by highlighting the worst case scenario? But we don't know. More research is needed. I think, of course, as with all these studies, there's questions about generalizability. So would we see similar effects with other photos in other cities or looking at other natural hazards? We also certainly are curious about the effects of this sort of intervention on other behaviors, and particularly more costly behaviors. So we observed small changes in response to the photos according to baseline risk, but we don't know whether those changes have implications for mitigation action. And in fact, I think, we would love to know more about whether website visitation actually induces mitigation action by homeowners. So if property owners in Ashland and elsewhere are self-reporting, that this sort of information, this property specific information is really important, is really an incentive, or the lack of it is a barrier to doing work, do we know whether providing that information actually causes homeowners to follow through? And so in thinking about that, I think there's some interesting research to be done. And I think also thinking about other creative ways to intervene and to measure behaviors that matter most for reducing home destruction to wildfire. To the extent that these findings are somewhat generalizable, I think that we can think about relevance to natural hazards, so how organizations communicate risk, climate change, and whether to focus on an uninhabitable Earth or on hope and progress, or perhaps even to public health campaigns and COVID-19 or vaccination, maybe the importance of understanding population characteristics and underlying risks and how people might respond differently to different interventions. Throughout this process, I would say that there was a great benefit through the research co-production process, which allowed us to uncover opportunities and assumptions that made for great research questions and contributing evidence towards those assumptions. And then also co-benefits from this research practice partnership. So we learned about human behavior and then also invested in research and interventions that have real consequences and implications for wildfire programs and the communities in which they work. So thank you. So that's, I look forward to questions and certainly hypotheses or ideas to aid in interpretation of some of these results. And thanks for listening.
Hilary, I see that there are 3 questions in the chat box. Would it be helpful if I read them to you so that you could respond?
Yes, please.
Okay, the first one is, have you thought of using a photo of the devastation post-fire?
That's interesting. Yeah, and that's the photo, the starting photo actually on this presentation here. It's the same scene in the photo we used on our postcard from the same exact perspective, just after. So no, but I think that it would be another way to certainly make those consequences salient. Yeah, good suggestion.
The next question is from William, and I see he's got his hand raised, so perhaps he'd prefer just to ask you. William, do you want me to read it or do you want to ask?
I can ask.
Okay.
I've got a good friend who lives in the mountains, and he's done all these mitigation efforts. He's got big pipes that put foam over his house, and there's a fire coming. And I'm just thinking, if he got one of the postcards with fire on it, he would be thinking, well, I've already mitigated that, so I don't need to be as worried about it, even though I'm in a high-risk area. So I'm just wondering the extent to which you were able to collect data from people about the extent to which they felt they'd already mitigated some of the risk.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea that maybe some of the response by the high-risk households was a feeling of lack of accuracy. Maybe I think one way to maybe disentangle that would be to see whether we have data on those factors that are under a homeowner's control. Like it sounds like those factors that your friend has taken action on, and then factors like background fuels that are not. And so maybe we could tease out, our folks that are just in high risk areas, and that risk is really driven by things there's nothing they can do about it. Is there a different response among those folks as compared to those who have really poor defensible space or structural characteristics that they could take action on. Yeah, that's a good suggestion.
That would be helpful.
Yeah.
So the next comment is from Jana, who said, as someone who's been evacuated for 3 fires, the photo of the fire where the point of view is likely homeowner, so from their front door, would elicit more of a response from me as it makes it more personal.
Yeah, that's great. I think,
yeah.
and I think that's, I would love to do the manipulation check survey with a sample of folks like Jana or in Ashland where that personal relevance really might be higher, and see what differences we might observe.
I see that Krister has his hand raised, so maybe we do that and then go back to the box. Krister?
All right. Thank you. That was a great presentation, Hilary. Good job. I wonder, how well do you think this research travels? I noticed in the one of the early slides, I don't know if it was from the experiment or a separate survey, where 82% of Ashland residents were already kind of motivated or interested in learning more. So that seems like a pretty high number. Like, this is clearly a salient issue for residents here, but there may be other parts, perhaps, I don't know, with a different political or demographic composition where that may not be the case, although that, objectively the risk might be just as high. So it seems to me like one of the big obstacles is to overcome that initial perhaps resistance or disinterest in this issue altogether, or perhaps not trusting the fire department, or for whatever reason, not being interested. So can you speak to that? How you think this type of manipulation or experiment would play out in places where you would have a higher proportion of disinterested individuals?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, because I think that is, as you noted, yeah, that 82%, it came from a household survey. I think it was about 1,100 respondents. So 1,100 Ashland residents had responded to the survey. Not all were surveyed, but and this is really kind of a hallmark of Ashland. If you talk to Ashland Fire and Rescue, that these residents tend to be very engaged. So I think there could be certain unique characteristics, and I also would say, if one of the big things we learned from this research is these subpopulation characteristics matter, right? Like, we can look at these overall effects and see nothing or see something, but often when you look at the characteristics of the populations, whether it's political partisanship or baseline interest in wildfire risk, that really might influence how these interventions affect behavior. So I think this warrants maybe funding for more research to find out. Yeah.
Can I add in? And
Sure.
Krister, you're one of the driving pieces of the overall project is to look in different communities. So Hilary made brief mention of similar work done in the western portions of Colorado with an organization, West Region Wildfire Council, and they work in very, very different kinds of communities. And their experiments have yielded results around 13%, so not as high as the 20% we saw in Ashland, but 13% going to these websites. And so your question is part of what's motivating going to different places, and we do intend to look over time at how responses vary by community. And we think it's absolutely a fundamental question here. So Courtney has a question. She's asking about whether or not you have thoughts about prospect theory, gain and loss framing under conditions of variable risk perception and uncertainty when pulling for specific behavioral response.
Yeah. See, I'll do my best to answer the question, and then let me know if I missed part of it. But I think, well, so prospect theory, as Courtney said, it's related to the idea, the loss aversion, and the idea that people respond differently to gains than they do to losses of equal amounts. And so this was something that I was really interested in when thinking about highlighting, using flames photos or even like a post flames destruction photo, that if making the losses more salient might affect homeowners differently than talking about the gains and the benefits of doing mitigation, of protecting your home versus risk of losing your home. And I think it's a great question, and I think it probably warrants some like clean identification, maybe in a lab first, to see if you can really isolate the effect of that it's really an equal amount of loss versus gain that you're targeting for people. Because often when you do these field studies and you're mimicking real world outreach, you have a lot of confounds. We're maybe eliciting emotion, we may be eliciting loss aversion. There could be elements of salience, and so isolating what drove the effect or lack of effect that we observed can be tough. So yes, I've thought about it, and yes, I think it's a really interesting question, and there's certainly preliminary work to suggest that people would respond differently. And I guess the question is, how do you design an intervention in the field that really identifies that clearly?
Great. So we have another question and statement. This is from Rob Segroy, who's actually one of our practitioner partners in the Teton Area Wildfire Protection Coalition. And he asks, we have internally deliberated what the most effective imagery would be to promote wildfire risk reduction. Hence, the subject is helpful. One approach we took was to show before mitigation and after mitigation photos, trying to show an attractive landscape post-mitigation. Do you have thoughts if that is effective in incentivizing wildfire risk reduction action?
Oh, good question, Rob. I think, let's see. Well, so to the extent that there was some sort of willful ignorance or people avoided engaging with their risk in this study because they didn't want to have to do things that felt uncomfortable, like perhaps removing vegetation that they found to be beautiful on their property, that sort of intervention, showing folks that there's no need to be afraid, that it can actually still look really nice afterwards, perhaps could be something that might cause people to not respond in that way. And so I think, I think that warrants testing, maybe, that I guess, what we need to find out is the extent to which that inhibits action, and then see if maybe that might be a good solution for getting people to follow through. So yeah, good research idea.
Yeah. We have another comment from Chris Barth, who is a practitioner partner from the Bureau of Land Manager, but he also has his hand up. So Chris, do you want to just ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Hannah, and thanks, Hilary. I think my comment was kind of geared in response a little bit to William and Rob's comment there. I really like that idea of the imagery really demonstrating ideal mitigation or different mitigation practices. And I think that'd be really good tied with a project that was specifically geared towards the application of some sort of mitigation action on a property. I like this one kind of in more of a general sense, right? Like, I think we're looking at like, hey, identifying, hey, you have wildfire risk, and really alerting folks, like gearing them towards, this is where you are on the wildfire risk spectrum. But yeah, if you wanted to drill down, I really like the idea of using sort of an ideal and less ideal mitigation photo to see which image people, maybe self-identify with. And that ties in really nicely with some of the other work that Wyrie's done in really understanding what their perception is of the mitigation work that's already on their property. Do they have good defensible space? And so I really like that idea of a comparison for, again, something along the lines of like a cost share program and really zeroing in on the details.
Great, thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris. So we have another comment here from Jana. There may be some reticence in response, possibly connected to the cost of mitigation efforts. I would imagine that most people understand that tree removal, as an example, is a very high cost. And if there were some language on the postcard stating that grants and or financial support might be possible, that may create interest in learning more. Wildfire Partners in Boulder, Colorado does often communicate that financial incentives may be available and that mitigation may help with insurance costs.
Yeah, that is an excellent point. And I think, Hannah, we've certainly talked about that as something that would be great to test too. You know, a lot of programs spend a lot of money providing cost share, a lot of resources go into this. And so if we could better identify how important that is, you know, how much response do you get from that information, and then maybe even where you set those cost share levels, then that could be really useful information for the efficient use of resources.
Yeah, and when we first started talking to Ashland about doing this work, they were waiting to hear whether or not they would get a big FEMA grant that had funds to support mitigation. So for cost shares, the timing of the two pieces, learning about the money that they might or might not get from FEMA and the project, they just didn't line up well. But we definitely played with the idea of having some kind of, you know, really different approach that was looking at how can we galvanize people through a temptation about exactly this, some financial incentive. So thank you for that. It is an important set of questions.
Yeah, and I think two follow-up points on that. One, you know, this mitigation work is tremendously expensive for a lot of folks, and so likely really changing risk on the ground is going to require greater intervention than changing photos on a postcard. So I think that's worth noting. Also, I think following on your point, Hannah, about working with Ashland to try to think about how could we test this? It can be really, you know, often we're left with changing photos on postcards or messages on postcards because, changing or randomly offering an incentive to some homeowners and not to other homeowners, even just at first and staging rollouts can be a difficult thing to convince partners who have constituents that they're accountable to that's a reasonable way to deliver their programs. Yeah.
That's a great point. And it does look like we're almost out of time. Does anybody have any final questions? I think we're good. Nice work, Hilary.
All right. Thank you. Thank you all for joining. And happy Monday.